As you know, Meineke Library and libraries like it aim to encourage engagement with the past in the present to transform the future. Today is a special day for that work and for the talk we're about to hear. Today in New Haven is the anniversary of the landing in 1638, the anniversary of the landing of the party led by the Reverend John Davenport and Theophilus Eaton, who sailed in New Haven Harbor that day with a group of fellow settlers. It's the anniversary of New Haven colonization. So it's a good day. Every day is a good day, but today is an anniversary day. Is a particularly good day to remember and reflect and to recommit ourselves to doing hard history, to doing real history, to doing a history that reckons honestly with our past, and doing history, to invoke Du Bois, history worthy of grown folks. As it turns out, we have a bit of a tradition growing and being extended and elevated today in Mondays at Meineke of doing New Haven stories around this time of year, around the anniversary of New Haven colonization. Last year at this time, we had two talks, also in conjunction with the Yale Slavery Research Project about New Haven. One was on the Black College proposal of 1831, and one was about the life and legacy of Jethro Luke and his family. And that latter talk had its origins in a talk that I first gave on this date, April 24th, 2017, 6 years ago in the before times, about James Wadsworth's 1748 map of New Haven. So today is a particularly good day locally to do the work of memory and recovery of history. We are really excited, delighted, and honored to have with us one of the great colleagues of this library, Hope McGrath, who's lead researcher for the Yale Slavery Research Project, who's been a writer at Yale for 6 years, has her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, has been doing great work of recovery, great work of memory, great work of knitting stories together, bringing stories together, and bringing them down to the present. We are grateful that you're here, Hope. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction and for inviting me to present today. It's a real privilege to share what I've learned about Robert M. Park and about how I've got here to this point. I hope that by sharing my experience of finding Robert Park in the archives, it might encourage others to get in the archives themselves and ask the questions that they care about. First, I'd like to start with a little background about the Yale Slavery Research Project. In the fall of 2020, Yale President Peter Salovey charged a working group of faculty, staff, and community members, asking them, quote, to investigate Yale's historic entanglements and associations with slavery, the slave trade, and abolition. You can see the charge here, and it appears on the President's Office website. Now, we have a small group of researchers who have been digging in the archives, especially in the Yale Library collections. And David Blight, Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale, is writing a narrative history, which will be published by Yale University Press. And we have been looking into the lives of enslaved people who worked on Yale's campus, who helped to build its buildings and take care of Yale students and professors. We've also been looking at how Yale and New Haven people were involved in abolition and pro-slavery causes, and the part that they played in the Civil War. And then another area of research is into how the Civil War and slavery have been remembered and memorialized here at Yale. Now, from the beginning, we knew that this person pictured here, Benjamin Silliman, would be important to the story of Yale and slavery. This is one of many paintings of Silliman that Yale owns. Silliman was Yale's first professor of chemistry and natural history. He started the country's most prestigious and influential scientific journal, and he was a leader in developing and really establishing scientific education at Yale. One of his most lasting contributions was bringing a collection of over 10,000 geological rocks to Yale. It was known as the Gibbs Cabinet, and it actually became the foundation of the Peabody Museum's collection. Silliman, like so many prominent and wealthy Americans, also had deep ties to slavery. Mary Silliman, his mother, was the single largest enslaver in Fairfield County, Connecticut. The family sold 2 enslaved people in order to pay for Benjamin and his brother to attend Yale. Now, by 1796, Silliman was openly abolitionist, but for many years after that, he and his brother continued to own human beings whom they leased out to their neighbors. Silliman was a colonizationist, meaning he endorsed relocating Black people to Africa, and he co-founded the Connecticut Colonization Society in 1829. Silliman died in 1864, and up to his death, he was quite ambivalent when it came to emancipation and the Civil War. Clearly, he was a complicated person, and now, thanks to the work of historian Eric Hirschtel, we also know a lot about how Silliman's scientific work was connected to slavery, well after he developed his anti-slavery beliefs personally. Silliman traveled extensively through the South, and he built relationships with major enslavers. He became close friends with Eli Whitney, the inventor of the con gin. And I would encourage anyone who might be interested in these issues, particularly the connections between early science and slavery, to read Hirschtel's excellent book, The Science of Abolition: How Slaveholders Became the Enemies of Progress. Silliman's ownership of other human beings has never been a secret. It's something he wrote about during his lifetime. It's been documented by his biographers, and it was included in the 2001 Yale Slavery and Abolition Report. That said, before we go any further, I just like to take a moment here to read the names, to include the names, and acknowledge the people who we know were enslaved by Benjamin Silliman, his mother, and his brother. And here I'm drawing on the really valuable work of the Vincent J. Roosevelt Register of Slaves in Fairfield, Connecticut. And their research has been really valuable to us. The names of the people who at this time we know were enslaved by Benjamin Silliman are Tigo, Sue, Rose, Lois, Peter, Job, Eli, Annis, Charles, Chloe, and Iago. Silliman remains a significant figure at Yale. He's so important that one of Yale's 14 residential colleges is named for him. Here you can see the beautiful Silliman College courtyard. And as I said before, we knew he would be important for the Yale and Slavery book. And so as part of this research, I found a wonderful document. Here is a picture. It's called An Address Delivered at the Unveiling of the Statue of Benjamin Silliman at Yale College. The statue of Silliman was dedicated at Yale in 1884. And so I was hoping that this record of the speeches that were given at the event, at the dedication, would tell us about the time when the statue was dedicated, the 1880s, how the Civil War was being remembered at Yale. And it was helpful in this regard, but it was more valuable for introducing me, or reintroducing me as it turned out, to someone named Robert M. Park. The speaker chosen for the dedication was Andrew Dixon White. At the time, he was president of Cornell University. He was actually one of the founders of Cornell. He had gone to Yale, graduated from Yale, and when he was a student at Yale, he was an abolitionist in the early 1850s. White, in giving his speech in honor of Silliman, acknowledged that Silliman could seem imperious to those who saw him giving orders in the lecture room. And as an example, he told this story in his speech, which had appeared in a Yale student publication about Silliman's relationship with someone he called his faithful servant. And I'll just read the remarks. Professor Silliman says to a student, "How would I test sulfuric acid?" The student answers, "You would taste it." Silliman indignantly responds, "Taste it, sir, it would burn my tongue out. Tell me, how would I test sulfuric acid?" And the student responds, "You would make Robert test it." So this was told as a joke. It was supposed to tell us something about Silliman's error and how he treated his faithful servant. And that was in White's speech. And obviously it caught my attention. In addition, I learned from the Yale Daily News article printed here in 1884 at the time of the dedication that Robert Park was actually at the dedication when White was giving this speech, was telling the story about him. Robert Park was there, and it describes him as, for many years, the colored assistant of the deceased professor. and he was on hand to draw back the covering that was draped over the statue. So when it was revealed, Robert Park was given sort of the honor, but also the menial task of drawing back the cover from the statue. So who was Robert? Who was this Robert Park mentioned in these sources? And here I'd like to pause for a moment and bring us back to the year 2022 and a conversation I had with a member of the Yale Slavery Working Group, Charles Warner Jr. Charles works in the New Haven Public Schools and is chair of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. He is also the historian of the Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ, originally established as the Temple Street Congregation. And Charles is one of the most knowledgeable people you will meet about New Haven history. Back in September, Charles met with me and shared some of the stories of his church and its people, which recently celebrated its 200th anniversary. And there are many connections between the Temple Street Congregation and Yale. Edward Boucher, the first African-American student to receive a PhD and a Yale student, and many other early Black students and employees had ties to Temple Street Church. It was a center of the Black community and one of the centers of the abolition movement in New Haven from the time it opened its doors. And one of the people Charles told me about was Robert Park. Charles pointed me to a really great resource and one I would recommend to anyone who's interested in these issues. It's called The African Abroad. It's a 2-volume work written by William Henry Ferris, who was an African-American member of the Yale College class of 1895. And in one of the chapters entitled Some Colored History Makers, Ferris wrote here that Park was a mathematician and an astronomer. This was the reputation that Park had within the Black community. So that was my start, seeing the name Robert in the speech, finding him that he was at the dedication, and then remembering, yes, what Charles had told me and what Ferris had recorded, that this was a person who was known for his scientific and mathematical abilities. Remember, Ferris named Park as one of his colored history makers. Meanwhile, White, the president of Cornell, had said that all Yale students of his generation would have remembered Robert as Silliman's faithful servant. So 2 views of the same person. I wanted to learn more. So the first thing I did was I checked the secondary sources, the biographies that had been written about Silliman, for any mention of Park, and more broadly, any mention of Silliman having an assistant, having a servant. Nothing. I did not find anything in the secondary literature about Park. And here I have some more representations of Silliman. This is a painting actually of Silliman by Samuel Morse, another residential college namesake. Before Morse was the inventor of the telegraph, before he was a pro-slavery, anti-immigrant activist, he was a painter, and he painted this portrait of Benjamin Silliman. And here's a sketch of Silliman's home, his house. And as far as we know, as of yet, we have not found any likenesses of Robert Park, and no sketches of any of his homes. So Park didn't show up in any of the historical works about Silliman, and I was disappointed, but I wasn't surprised. But I went somewhere else, and I did find him here in The Life of Benjamin Silliman, which is actually a collection of Silliman's own writing. So it includes his journals, some manuscript materials, some correspondence. This was compiled after his death. And Robert Park does show up in several places in The Life of Benjamin Silliman, particularly in the entries from 1835. In that year, Silliman's reputation was really growing. He was invited to give a series of lectures in Boston to the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. At this point, Silliman was already well known as a scientist, a textbook author. As I said, he had founded this really important scientific journal. But he was keen to further bolster his reputation. He needed to attract funding. And the opportunity to go to Boston and give these lectures was going to be well-paying, but it also promised to connect him to larger audiences. So here are the journal entries where we find Robert Park. The morning of March 3rd was passed with Robert in the temple in arranging the specimens into groups and in preparing for the first lecture. March 5th. In the morning, I was almost entirely at home, received many calls, gave Robert liberty to go and amuse himself. So this on a day when they weren't working in the lab, Robert Park was allowed to go off and do his own thing. March 6th, made gases with Robert for the afternoon lecture. March 9th, I am well and all goes well, charmingly indeed. Cordiality and interest and numbers far beyond my expectations. Robert is well and does exceedingly well. He is much admired in his station and is regarded by the audience as a sub-professor. So here, this was very exciting. In Silliman's own journal, we find not only a record of the actual work he and Park did together, preparing specimens, making gases, getting ready for the lectures, but we also find something of the audience's perception of Park, this appearance of being what Silliman called a sub-professor. You also, I think, get a sense of Silliman's own pride and investment in Park's success. He says he is well and does well. And we don't have access to Park's own writing, his reflections on this. We don't have any record of that, but I do think we can imagine something of Park's commitment and investment in this enterprise. He had traveled to Boston with Silliman. He had left his own family behind. He stayed with Silliman for over a month, and they worked intensely to make a success of this venture. So we find another really important entry in the journal, this time over a month later, April 11th. Silliman writes, at 6:00 a.m., in company with my faithful Robert, I left Boston for Providence. As objections might be made to the admission of a colored man into the passenger cars of the first class, and being unwilling to disturb the feelings of one who had served me so well and contributed materially to my success, I went with him into one of the unoccupied cars of the second class. So here we really get a sense of this relationship and of this journey, and learn a lot about what it was to be traveling with an African-American man in 1835 in New England. This idea that they would not have been welcomed, as Silliman recognized, in the first class. So he decided, and I can imagine this was an act of self-sacrifice on Silliman's part, that he would go into the second class with Robert. But here what I want to really emphasize and take a look at is Silliman's own acknowledgement that Park had contributed materially to his success. And what does that mean in dollar terms? Well, the fee for the Boston lectures was reported to be $2,000. And Silliman was invited to return the following year and give another series of lectures. After all the expenses were paid of the next year's lectures, he earned an additional $2,200. And after this, he gave a gift to his daughter when she got married of $1,000. By my calculation, that gift of $1,000 would be the equivalent of over $74,000 today. So that's quite a wedding gift. Again, we don't know, we haven't been able to find yet what additional pay or bonus or gift he gave to Robert, aside from this acknowledgement in his journal that he had contributed materially to his success. At this point in my journey to find Robert Park, I was pretty happy. He turns out he's in the historical record quite a lot, but I knew I wanted to find him beyond his work. What else was he besides his work? And we find him here at church. Amos Beeman was the first Black pastor of the Temple Street Church, and he kept these amazing scrapbooks that document not only the life of his parish, but also of New Haven, particularly a Black New Haven in the 19th century. And the scrapbooks are at the Beinecke, but they've also been digitized as well, so they're accessible to anyone who wants to use them. And here on this page on the left, Beeman wrote a list of the persons who first contributed to the church. And we find Robert M. Park, his name is listed 5th on the list. And as I said before, the Temple Street Church was really one of the centers of Black community life in New Haven. And many of the parishioners were heavily involved in abolition, temperance, and other social and political movements. And again, Beeman documented this work. And in one of his scrapbooks, we find Park's name again as a delegate from New Haven to the Connecticut State Convention of Colored Men, which was held in the city in 1849. And here are just some outtakes to give you a sense of what this work was like. The convention was held to consider our political condition and to devise measures for our elevation and advancement. And it includes this statement: we find the doors of the high schools, academies, and seminaries generally closed against our children. And it also includes a message to the voters of the state of Connecticut arguing for Black suffrage. In addition to these records, I want to mention the New Haven City Directories as a really valuable source of information that Mike Moran introduced me to. They're in the Beinecke, they're in the Yale Library, but they're also digitized. And here's a sampling of some of the entries for Robert M. Park over the years. In 1853, he's listed colored sexton chemistry room. He's listed as a janitor in 1874 and as a caterer and janitor of the Hopkins Grammar School in 1885. So by this point, we know that Park was active in his church, active in political movements, a laboratory assistant, and I wanted to know about his family. And we already knew from Ferris that his family connections were important. And in fact, we learned from the census that Robert was married to a woman named Frances. They had 3 daughters, Eliza, Fanny, and Harriet. Eliza married this man, Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett, who made his own mark on history as the first ever Black diplomat from the United States. Bassett grew up in Connecticut. He took classes at Yale, and he was the first Black graduate of the Connecticut Normal School. He was a teacher in New Haven when he met and married Eliza Park. And in 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant appointed Bassett to be the minister resident to Haiti. This was the equivalent of an ambassador before that title was used. Ebenezer and Eliza Bassett and their children are buried in Grove Street Cemetery. And I'm going to skip ahead just a moment and speak about Eliza Park Bassett. Her obituary appeared in the New Haven Evening Register. And she is praised and credited here in this paragraph. You can see with much of her husband's success when he served as ambassador. And here in this lengthy tribute to Eliza Park, we learn more about her father as well. It says she was the daughter of Robert M. Park. Mr. Park was for more than 30 years in the service of the elder Professor Silliman, who was wont to speak of him to the college folk as, quote, my friend and assistant. It was currently said on the college campus that he knew all the learned professor's lectures by heart. Every living graduate of Yale for 30 years up to the 50s must remember him, for chemistry was then obligatory with the seniors, and hundreds of other alumni remember him as a skull and bones man. So Robert Park was still living when his daughter Eliza died. And here is a picture of the Park family tombstone listing the names of their children. This is a picture of one of those children, Robert Park's grandson, Eliza Park Bassett's son, Ulysses S. Grant Bassett, named, of course, for the president who appointed his father to the diplomatic service. Eliza and her father, Robert, died within a few weeks of each other in 1895, but one of the bright parts of the story for me is that they both lived to see Ulysses Bassett graduate from Yale with a class of 1895. Like other Bassett children, Ulysses became a respected teacher and was remembered years later by his pupils in Washington, D.C. as a keen mathematician and an excellent teacher. And I think that those are gifts he must have shared with his grandfather, Robert. Robert died shortly after Eliza, and here we have one of the tributes printed in the New Haven Evening Register. Robert M. Park, one of the oldest and best known colored citizens of the city, died at his home last night. He was for many years the janitor of Skull and Bone Society building and was well and favorably known by a great many Yale men. And a few days later, the same newspaper, and remember this is the white newspaper, this is the leading newspaper of the city, covered Park's funeral. It says, Robert Park's funeral yesterday afternoon was attended by a number of Yale men, members of the Skull and Bone Society. Among them were Charles Hopkins Clark of Hartford, editor of the Hartford Courant, Judges Baldwin and Townsend, Collector Babcock, Dr. Foster, Thomas Hooker, Professor Schwab, and Winthrop Dwight. The college faculty were also represented by Professors H.P. Wright and Phillips. Robert Park was the laboratory assistant of both the Professors Silliman in their chemical lectures in Yale College and was janitor of Skull and Bones for more than 20 years. And even if these names aren't immediately recognizable to us, they are a who's who of Yale and New Haven society. They're all associated with Skull and Bones. So Winthrop Dwight was the son and great-grandson of 2 Yale presidents. Baldwin and Townsend were prominent judges. There was the editor of the Hartford Courant and a number of other great and good people who showed up to the funeral. And the story traveled far. This is an article that appeared in the Boston Herald. And it was reprinted in the Springfield Daily Republican, and it says, Mr. Park was an attaché of the exclusive Skull and Bone Society of Yale. It was necessary that he be made a member. He was therefore initiated and allowed to wear the emblem of the society. He was the only man not a graduate of the college who was ever admitted to the clubhouse. And now to conclude, I'd just like to reflect a little bit on these sources. And here again are just a few of the images we have of Benjamin Silliman. We don't know of any images yet of Robert Park or his wife or his 3 children. And here are some of the major books that discuss Silliman and his family and work. And again, Robert Park wasn't here in these particular works. So we have a beautiful residential college and this great statue of Silliman. And we also have his extensive papers, 90 boxes of material, over 36 linear feet of documentation about Silliman and his world. And I hope it goes without saying that I'm delighted that we have these materials, and the Yale libraries are an absolute treasure. And it shouldn't be a surprise that we have relatively few materials about Robert Park. Our archives have not been constructed with African Americans or working class people or other marginalized people in mind, and neither have our institutions or our daily lives. But Robert Park has been a good reminder and lesson for me that just because these folks haven't been much considered in the historical works doesn't mean that they were absent from history itself. So I hope that I've been able to share that Robert Park was there in the 1830s, helping prepare the lectures in Boston. He was in Yale. He was in New Haven, organizing his church and pushing forward the cause of Black freedom. And he was sharing his knowledge of mathematics and science and astronomy with his children and his community. And he was there in 1884, pulling back the cover off the Silliman statue. So I wish we had 36 linear feet about Park and about all the men and women who worked at Yale. But when we go back to the collections like the Silliman papers with these new eyes and new questions that we're bringing to the archive, I am actually really optimistic that we will continue to find rich documentation that will help us tell these stories in a fuller way, because people like Park might not show up in the finding aids, but they were there all along. And I do think the archives contain sometimes a surprising amount about them once we look at them in sort of a new way. And if we do, and if we find those stories, I think we'll just keep having even fuller and richer and more complete stories to tell. So thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about Robert Park.
Thank you, Hope, for bringing your eyes new to these materials, and most importantly, for synthesizing them so well and bringing them to us. I was thinking on the comment you were just making, I'll share in the chat. Some who are on campus will know the news, others will know as it spreads that the trustees of Yale voted on the weekend to confer honorary master's degrees on the Reverend James W.C. Pennington and the Reverend Alexander Crummell. And in one of the biographies, in the biography of Crummell, in the notes, it notes that, you know, at the time, the archivist at Yale said there were no official records. But as you know, and as the biographies show, there are testimonies, documentation, and it's a story that is along the lines of what you were saying. If you look, you can find, and it is there, and it may not be in the titles and the finding aids, but you have done extraordinary work in pulling the story of Robert M. Park together from community memory, from archival sources, newspapers, and again, thank you for sharing. I wanted to start and invite people to post questions, but I wanted to start with a question about you, and I know that this may not be tremendously comfortable because you were one of those people whose genius is in inverse proportion to how much you promote yourself. But I'm gonna put you on the spot, and because I think it'll be generative for people to think about. How did you get into this work? You know, when was it? You did your PhD in 19th century history at Penn. What was it, you know, in your own life that influenced you to commit yourself and to see that there could be a professional career in history?
Okay, so I'll take the question. It's not my favorite kind, but I do think it's one I'm happy to talk about. I came to history as a discipline because I was really interested in sort of the big questions, sort of the big questions of how history moves, how do we get to the world today, how has it been made, how people made the world that we have. But I was from the beginning really interested in sort of you know, old school social history, history from the bottom up, studying working class people, enslaved people, groups like that. But to be honest, especially in graduate school and when I did my PhD work, I was really sort of interested in some of the big pictures, the big arguments in history, the big books, you know, working Not as much on a granular level. I did work in the archives, obviously, for my dissertation, but this project, coming back to this work with the Yale Slavery Project, has really given me sort of a completely fresh appreciation for the moment that we are all working in, and the opportunity we all have to be historians. And I truly believe this. The amount of archival material that's available to us and accessible to us, because it has been digitized in recent years, is phenomenal. And either I didn't know about it as a graduate student, or I wasn't engaged with it on the same level. But I don't think there could be a better time to be a genealogist, a local historian, someone who just has questions about their own city or their community, or any kind of issue, to get in and see what you can access through libraries like the Yale libraries or others in your community. Ancestry.com. Obviously, with the pandemic, we all had to sort of pivot and figure out, well, what can we do from home? But we're left with a real mandate at the same time to make these collections more accessible to everyone. And I know that that's a priority for you and for Yale. So I don't know if that's really an answer about my own path, but one that I didn't consider myself necessarily a local historian before. And now I think that there isn't a better time to be one. And we need more local historians in every locality to do this work and figure out what the stories are of our own towns and our own places. It feels important right now in a way that maybe it didn't before.
And I think what your talk showed, the news of Crummell and Pennington, and we've talked about this, you've been brilliant in keeping your eyes open and making the connections, the local ties to national networks and the influence New Haven has nationally, and then the ways that national efforts tie back into New Haven. So I think you situate, I've shared, others probably have seen, there's a portrait of Benjamin Silliman, the father, in the National Portrait Gallery. And as the sort of father of American scientific education, and I think your work will lead us all to reconsider. Nobody is the father by themselves of anything, and so Robert M. Park is a nationally significant figure. Probably, I think your research is certainly suggesting that. It may show. I wanted to, in those networks and you geospatially as well as familially and religious congregations. We have in the audience one of the great scientists and scholars of Edward Boucher, Dr. Mickens, who's one of the people, along with Dr. Patton and others, responsible for that story being preserved, elevated, and in circulation. And you noted Park and the church. Boucher's father, William, was in custodial work, as was Park. And it strikes me that one might, and I want to invite you to say what we might know, what you might speculate, and how you might go either yourself or invite others to join this work of the Boucher-Park connection, scientific church, and the sort of legacy connections. New Haven was not a big place, so pretty much everybody knew each other. And as you build out networks and think about the relationships, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Boucher family and the Park family.
Sure. I mean, I think it's reasonable to say it's a small community. It's not a huge church. That William Boucher, Edward Boucher's father, did custodial work at Yale. That certainly would have known the Parks and the Park family. And I think, thinking about networks is also thinking about families and what people hope for their children and the kind of work that they were doing. I think it's really telling if you go back to that statement from the convention that I read, where one of the big pushes was that it said we find the doors of the academies and the seminaries are closed against our children. Certainly, this must have been a concern that William Boucher, Robert Park, and many other men and women must have felt. There were anyone who cares about the next generation, parent or not, feels those sort of pressures and frustrations. What is this world that what will this world be for my children? And you can see with Robert Park and with Edward Boucher's accomplishments that the previous generation was trying to build social and political movements for themselves, but they were building them for their children too. And then you see Edward Boucher sort of pushing open that door when it becomes possible to get his undergraduate education at Yale and then to go on for his PhD. just as the Bassett children. We know at least 2 of the Bassett children attended Yale, and several of them, the girls as well, even though they would not have been allowed to study at Yale, they went on to become teachers as well. They entered the education field. I don't know if that is saying much. I haven't found any, concrete links between these families, but you can see them pushing forward the political movements, and then seeing how their children and grandchildren are kind of pushing through those doors that the grandparents are trying to crack open for them in the 1830s, 1840s. It's very early.
Thank you for that. We had a question that are there any living descendants of Robert Park? Whether you know, and thoughts on tracing descendants.
I don't recall. I know that the person who would know is Charles Warner, because there are descendants that are still part of the Dixwell Congregational Church from some of these early families, and others where those descendants are not known or not living in New Haven today. That's not something that the Yale Project has started to do in an organized fashion, although I have had occasion to talk to some descendants from early Black student families, and it's certainly an area where we need to do more outreach, I believe, and to see what that living memory would be like in those families today. I think that would be a great source, another source of research, another type of archive that we should try to relate with.
Great. We have a question from an audience member asking if you're able to elaborate. So either if you know, or if you have suggestions on ways to find more on what it meant to be a caterer, since that was one of the occupations that is listed associated with Park.
Yeah, I think Ferris is a good source on this in general, and he does go into sort of different people in town and what they did. And so Ferris talks a little bit about that. I think my understanding, and again, others, I would want to check with Charles too, that in some cases, African-American men who had catering business would be asked to cater events at Yale. So for the clubs or the societies in town. So I think that it was still a relationship for the most part with the university.
Thank you. I wanted to note for everyone who's online with us, we have a temporary exhibit in the library mezzanine that will be up through this weekend with some of the materials that Hope showcased. So you can see in 3 dimensions some of the materials from the archives, the photographs of Ulysses Simpson Grant Bassett, both in his 1895 and his 40th reunion with William Ferris, the 1849 convention that was held in New Haven, the document from the Beeman scrapbook. So encourage anybody who's around to pop into Beinecke for that pop-up display. Wanted to turn back to the overall work of Yale and Slavery Research. You, as the lead researcher, are doing extraordinary work, and you've got a number of colleagues. And I wonder if you just sort of talk a little bit about the effort, the sort of sources and methods. We have an audience that is made up of people who are do this work themselves all the time, some who are just getting into it. But I wonder if you could give a little sense of the scope of sources and methods in the work that's going on in the Yale and Slavery Research.
Sure, and I think one of the things that maybe distinguishes the project a bit that we're very proud of is the extent of the archival research that's informing every single part of the book. It's, as I said, a narrative history that's being written by Professor David Blight. It begins in the 17th century with really the prehistory of Yale College before the collegiate school was founded, with the Native American wars, the wars with the Native Americans and between European settlers that really shaped the landscape. And so we go back there to the Yale Indian Papers Project. We have letters written by, for example, one of the founders and early trustees of Yale about warfare with Native Americans. We go into the founding of the college, and looking particularly, we've looked at every founder and our major donors, trustees, and been able to trace the find who among our founders were enslavers, try to recover the names of the people who were enslaved. We know this has been a partial effort, but to date, we've been able to identify over 200 enslaved people who were enslaved by Yale founders, donors, trustees. Again, this is the start. And then we have worked really assiduously through some of the major collections that are in the Yale libraries. And again, this work of kind of reading against the grain to find out maybe not what was intended when these materials were preserved, but to find out as much as we can. So the Woolsey papers, the Edwards papers, these really big collections at Yale, there are connections to slavery, to anti-slavery at every stage. And the book goes into the early 20th century. As much as possible, we are trying to recover the voices of enslaved people and African-American people, particularly. It becomes easier in the late 19th century with the early Black students. So people like Edward Boucher, but others, John Wesley Manning, Ferris, these really scholarly, ambitious African-American students who pushed open these doors. It's tough. I mean, we talk about this being Yale and slavery, a history. It's not the history. There is much more work to be done. But with all of this, I mean, my hope, at least, and I think this is shared by everyone in the project, is that this will be inspiring and encouraging for other people to say, wow, there is documentation out there. There are archives that can help us answer these questions. It's not unknowable. And to have some optimism about what's out there. So it's exciting, but there's a lot of research still to come.
Well, and I think the presentation like yours will hopefully excite some in the audience, those who will see it online, and other presentations will be done to add to this network activation. Thinking about networks, I wonder if you could comment some on the Institute for Colored Youth, and if I might put you on the spot a little bit, just to let people know. I can do a little bit of descriptive stuff, but I'll put it on you if you can. What the Institute for Colored Youth was, if folks don't know, because obviously there's a Bassett, Boucher, and a sort of network, and the three Bs in some ways, Bassett, Boucher, and Boyer, probably more than that. But again, it reflects the intersecting networks locally and nationally. So I wonder if you might talk about ICY.
Sure. Institute for Colored Youth was African-American school in Philadelphia. It was founded by Quakers. And, many people who might just know about Edward Boucher may recognize that this is where he spent a good portion of his career, I believe 26 years teaching at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Bassett was a principal there. He was a principal. He left New Haven to take a better paying job at this Quaker-run school. It was an academy that taught a classical education. The Latin was taught. It was a very serious academy for Black students. And Edward Boucher ends up there. He's teaching for 26 years. One of the people he most likely intersected with was Charles Boyer, who graduated from Yale in the 1890s. He attended ICY, and then from there ends up going to New Haven, attending Hopkins, and then Yale. So we can see there were, very promising, serious Black students. Boyer goes on to be the president of a Black college in the South afterwards. He spends his life as a dean and an administrator of a historically Black college. So we see these people moving in the same networks and finding each other and finding Yale. The other story that most people might know about Boucher and ICY is another example of sort of the national story intersecting with the personal and the local, is that Boucher is fired along with the entire staff of the ICY when the Board of Trustees decides to switch to a vocational model under the influence of Booker T. Washington's ideas at the time that were very popular and influential. And so a school like ICY, even though it hadn't been a scientific research institute for Boucher, they didn't have a laboratory, they didn't have a lot of the facilities that he would have been able to access had he worked at a college or university. It was still a place where you could teach very serious students. After he got fired, again, with the rest of the faculty, when the school decided to adopt a vocational rather than an academic model, he sort of it sets off on this path and ends up teaching at a variety of places. Never really landing anywhere for very long after that. He applied for a job at Yale and was not hired. But ICY kind of plays this part in this kind of drama of, as you see, Black educational opportunity actually contracting in the early 20th century under the influence of Booker T. Washington's views.
Thank you for that. We have a question from an audience member. We talked some about descendants of Park, but questions of Park's own birth, if it's known whether he was free or enslaved, and if we know anything, or if you have thoughts on how work might be done in our time or later to try and learn more about Park's ancestors, not just his descendants.
Thank you for that. Shrouded in mystery for me. I do not know. We have a birthday from how old we know he was when he passed away. There aren't that I have not been able to find any other records of him showing up on a census as a child that we could trace that way. I'm not sure if he was born in New Haven. I think that would take some I think, again, I think all of this is knowable. I think it would take some really sustained digging on the part of a genealogist, someone to maybe go back into some of the original records, maybe city records, and poke around a little bit more about that. But would love for someone to take that up.
I wanted to ask, sort of, has there been, as you've been in this work now for some time, the overall story maybe has had surprise, but perhaps not. But I wonder if anything has really stood out to you as surprising. You come into this again as a scholar of the 19th century, so it's not new terrain completely, but anything really sort of been an aha, wow moment for you?
I think the moments that really get me, I guess, are when you can imagine the human side of it, to picture the people in their time and place as much as that's possible. I know there's all kinds of issues with that, but for example, one of my favorite stories is about James Hillhouse, another big New Haven history person, obviously a monumental figure for New Haven, for the country, and being able to go back into his papers and his records and find that, in fact, he was an abolitionist. He spoke out against slavery, tried to limit the spread of slavery in the United States when he was in Congress. But at the same time, he enslaved several people, including children. He did not emancipate them. And so when you actually see that, when you see the documentation, when you see the letter, like there's a letter in the Hillhouse papers written from a woman who's a mother of a child who James Hillhouse is enslaving, writing him this heart-wrenching letter, asking him to take care of them, to protect her son who was being abused. He's 6 years old. I think I'm not going to say it's a surprise, but it is a way of making the story much more real and humanizing. And as I said, when I was in graduate school, a lot of this was extremely abstract to me. Maybe it's just getting older, getting more sentimental. But when you really spend time in someone's papers and sort of start to see them as a person, and then slavery is not an abstract condition or idea. It's not an issue in congressional debates over the future of the country. It's not, war is and civil war is not this sort of abstract. When it comes down and it's about a mother writing to a man about her 6-year-old, I think in that case, history still does have the capacity to surprise, because these were human relationships we're talking about. And so for me, that's been startling, actually, to see this on that human scale. I think that's another reason local history and even institutional history is important, is it takes these big national issues and it distills them down into a kind of a scale that I think it's easier for us to relate to on a more human level.
I appreciate that and share that with you. And I think that sort of shared the sense of humanity and recovering humanity in the history and the archives is another act and work that when two or more do it, it becomes even more exponential, and the sort of connecting of the stories. Geospatially, we've talked about some, and you talked some about addresses and places. And so literally from where I'm sitting, I can look up to where the Hopkins School was at the site of the Yale Law School. And across the block on Grove Street is where Robert M. Park lived, and then buried across the street from there in Grove Street Cemetery. And those sort of buildings and marks on a map are one thing, but knowing the real people and imagining Robert Park in this space and daily. And I mentioned to you the connection that the 240 Grove Street is the backyard, if not part of the property that Jethro Luke and 3 generations of his family owned, and to sort of reconsider the space that we think we know and who are the people who inhabited and made this space is really powerful and great. I wanted to put a note in the chat, and then I'll have one final open question for you, Hope. We will not have a Mondays at Beinecke on May 1st, but we do have 2 more coming up, and you will see everyone who's registered gets the Beinecke email newsletter in 2 weeks. On May 8th at 4 p.m., we'll be joined by Rebecca Miller, talking about the life and legacy of her mother, Inga McGrath, who's the centennial of her birth, great photojournalist. And then on May 15th, we'll have a session with some colleagues from Beinecke talking about community engagement. So hope that people will join us for that. I want to close, Hope, with a sort of open prompt to you, and you can give many answers, big things, small things. The announcement of the conferring of degrees on Crummell and Pennington is a real-world action that responds to calls from a number of folks on campus for that kind of work. The establishment of the Pennington Scholars for support for New Haven students to go to HBCUs that the president announced. You've talked some about ongoing scholarship, but I wonder if you think out 5-10 years from now, what do you hope will be some of the things? And again, it doesn't have to be the thing, but what are some of the things that you hope that the work you're doing, the work that's being done by this collective, what impact do you hope it will have? Because as you've noted, this is human history, this is real history, not just academic, and the book will be important, but in some ways its importance will be the work that it generates beyond. So look out 5 years, a decade, what do you hope will be some of the fruits of this labor?
Sure. I think on sort of an abstract level that I think is important for the concrete is I hope that we as a community, as Yale as an institution, as a city, I hope we have changed our conception of who built Yale, who belongs, who made this history. I think we've got to get away from looking at people's singular accomplishments. That's not to take away from Benjamin Silliman, that do not mean any disrespect to his great accomplishments and what he contributed to Yale. But we need to get away from this idea that people make their own history and they make it on their own terms. They don't, they make it together. And mostly we make it from the bottom up. There's a lot of people who contribute to the building of Yale and the building of what Yale is today. Its greatness, its eminence, its contributions. And so I hope that it's really a paradigm shift in thinking about who built this university and then who belongs today. And I think we're on our way. I think the university a few years ago, honored Pauli Murray with a residential college. And my favorite Pauli Murray quotation is when she said, we have to draw a larger circle. When people try to exclude me, we have to draw a larger circle to include them. And I think about that a lot. I think one of the fundamental work of Yale and Slavery Research Project is to draw a larger circle of who matters and whose history matters and who contributed to this university. I think if we do that and make that sort of paradigm shift, a lot of other concrete actions in the present and in the future will follow from them.
That is a perfect way to end. The only other better way is for me to share some of the comments we've had, which is wonderful presentation, exclamation point, intrepid research, and most importantly, thank you. We are all grateful for the circles that you were drawing and that you were drawing them so expansively and drawing us all into them. Hope, thanks so much. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Have a great day.